Good morning, folks. Welcome to this edition of Touring with Travis. I'm a little bit of a shadow here. It is a terrible, rainy, gloomy day here on Bald Head Island. And as some of you know out there, driving in Bald Head in the rain can be quite an interesting experience. So I bundled up in my rain boots and my rain gear and trekked on over here this morning. Wonder what the weather is like wherever you are listening from. So as always, give us a shout out in the comments there. Let us know where you're listening from. Let us know what your connection to Bald Head Island is. And I'd love to know what the situation is there, whether you're listening here in the Lower Cape Fear or from afar. As always, my name is Travis Gilbert. I'm the Educator and Collections Coordinator here at the Old Baldy Foundation. And since this pandemic kind of began, we have been offering virtual programming here at the Old Baldy Foundation. And we're so glad to be joining you once again for another edition of Quarantine Collections. And this morning, I brought out our oil transfer can, is what we call it. It's an oil transfer can. And this is what the keeper would have been using to place fuel atop Old Baldy Lighthouse, all right? And we're going to dive into what kind of technology and what kind of fuel was atop Old Baldy Lighthouse before the Civil War. But I thought that this would be a great opportunity to discuss what this pan, or what this transfer can was used for in our collections. And a little bit later in a future episode, I'll pull out our light bulb that also kind of helps illuminate the lighthouse lantern technology as we progress into the 20th century. Curious enough, Old Baldy was never electrified. Old Baldy Lighthouse was never electrified. She's the only lighthouse of the 7 left in North Carolina that was never electrified. Curious enough, she's the only of the 7 lighthouses in the state that has no official purpose. The other lighthouses still act as a navigational aid. Good morning, Michelle. Thank you for braving the weather to educate me. It's gloomy in Wrightsville Beach, too. I bet it is. Michelle, did you get the bad storms up there yesterday? On Monday? We got some terrible, terrible storms down here. So I'm curious to know what's going on up there. Phil, good morning, Phil. It's good to hear from you. I hope all is well over there in Southport. Let's check out here and see who else is joining us. Kara, hey, good morning, Kara from Kentucky. Kara bought us a microphone. Kara was very generous, and she reached out to us and said, hey, I'm buying a microphone for myself. She is an educator, and she's been educating Jace, her son, out there. And she said, I'm going to buy a microphone for my class. Would y'all like one as well? And we said, sure, absolutely. That's very, very kind of you. So Kara, thank you very much. We're looking forward to that microphone. And I'm sure all our other listeners are going to appreciate your generosity in purchasing that technology for us. Frank Newton. Frank Newton is a resident here in the Lower Cape Fear. And he has a litany of ancestors that were river pilots and lighthouse keepers and lifesavers. I've been learning a little bit about Frank and his ancestors through comments on the Southport Historical Society. And I really enjoyed, Frank, the whole feed yesterday evening, and it creeped into this morning with you connecting with some kin in this area, Frank Newton. Thank you for joining us this morning. And Michelle, she's saying, yes, it is very windy. And Logan, miss everyone at the lighthouse. Hope to see you all soon. Logan is one of the first people I met here at Old Baldy Lighthouse. Logan, I can't remember, Logan likes to play dress up just as much as I do. And I can't remember, Logan, what exactly you were dressed up as that day that we met. I was long before I was on staff. I'm trying to remember, Logan, maybe you can remind me. I can't remember if it was a pirate or it was a lighthouse keeper or whatnot. And Emmeline and Dan, good morning, Emmeline and Dan. It's great to hear from you up there in Earlysville, up Charlottesville, Virginia. I'm very, very glad that you enjoyed the presentation last night, Emmeline, and we are definitely hoping that the pieces of the Cape Fear Fresnel lens make it home as well. There's all kinds of wonderful people out there whose shoulders I'm standing upon that are making sure that we're getting as much of that lens back here at home as possible. So we really appreciate it. And Emmeline, thank you and Dan for your support this morning. All right, so Old Baldy Lighthouse. So if you recall in 1817, when Old Baldy Lighthouse is illuminated for the first time, sometime around that spring, perhaps April, they are reusing the lantern from the 1794 original lighthouse, recycling that lantern and placing it atop Old Baldy Lighthouse. And at the same time that they're recycling that lantern room and Old Baldy is illuminated for the first time in 1817, lighthouse technology is going through some growing pains, if you will. It is being spurred and growing and adapting to new technologies that were invented by the French, by a man with the last name Argan. All right, so Mr. Argan, this Frenchman, he developed what we call the Argan lamps. And you're going to be familiar with those lamps out there, I assure you. I remember them from a child at my grandparents' time. It was in 1782, he was a Swiss-born physicist living in France, Francois Pierre-Ami Argan, all right? And he invented this Argan oil lamp. And what was new about this lamp is it had a hollow wick. So I remember in Boy Scouts, what was the three things you needed to build a fire? You needed fuel, you needed heat, and you needed air. So when Mr. Argan developed this wick that was hollow, it increased the flow of air around the flame. Now the air can go around the flame from the outside of the wick, and it can also circulate inside the wick. And it's created a much brighter flame, and most importantly, a cleaner flame. Because these are being fueled by whale oil. All right, whale oil comes from the spermaceti whale that was hunted in the Atlantic, and they would take that oil back, and that is what's fueling these lamps. And that fuel tended to be very dirty. It produced a lot of soot, and the last thing you want on your lantern room is for the glass and the windows to get dirty. That's going to prevent a lot of that light from getting casted out onto the horizon for these mariners to use. So these hollow wicks produce this bright flame, but most importantly, it was a much cleaner flame, preventing some of that dirt and soot from getting onto the glass. Additionally, Mr. Argan created a chimney, a glass chimney of sorts that went around the wick. So it again pushed all that heat, pushed all the soot upwards, and continued to increase the airflow around that flame. Well, this technology was employed it was employed in Europe, and we did not get the exact European model. The Europeans tended to have much better technology than the Americans, and it tended to be much more efficient. And it was unfortunately that we got the short end of the stick here in America due to two individuals that worked collectively or coincidentally. The first was Stephen Pleasanton. Stephen Pleasanton was the 5th auditor of the United States. So he worked underneath the Department of the Treasury in the Revenue Service. And he, throughout the mid-19th century, when Old Baldy is being constructed and illuminated for the first time, up until the 1850s, he served as the administrator, the federal administrator, for the United States Lighthouse Service. we find it kind of crazy today that, you know, somebody that was never a mariner, that never worked at a lighthouse, he was an auditor, he was an accountant, he was a glorified accountant. He was placed with this awesome responsibility throughout much of the antebellum period for the facilitation, the management, the construction, the employment of the United States' lighthouses. That's going to have a significant consequence because, again, he was not a mariner and he had never worked in a lighthouse. So he's an auditor, he's an accountant. He is going to do everything he can to ensure that the lighthouse service remains efficient and it remains cheap. He wants to preserve the taxpayers' money and keep this bottom line for the lighthouse service as cheap as possible. That's where his interests are. Not in the efficiency of the lighthouses, but in its cheapness and keeping its budget low. So the second individual that is going to be very consequential towards developing argon lamps for the United States lighthouses is Winslow Lewis. And he's an American ship captain, and he created an American model of these argon lamps and convinced Stephen Pleasanton, who was in charge of America's lighthouses, to use his lamp, to use his patent. And in 1812, the U.S. government paid Winslow Lewis $20,000 to use his style lamps. We call them Lewis lamps. Now, you find there's really not much difference between the argon lamps in Europe and Winslow Lewis lamps here in America. Winslow Lewis basically copied what the Europeans were doing and made a significant amount of money and many, many contracts in the United States Lighthouse Service afterwards based on just slightly adapting these models. It followed this time-tested model, all right, that it was it used a glass chimney, it had a hollow woven cotton wick, and it had a fountain behind it that fed this whale oil into the lamp. And this Winslow Lewis lamp was used from about 1812 to 1840. Many continued to use the Winslow lamps up until 1858. So throughout Old Baldy's existence before the American Civil War, she is using these Winslow Lewis type lamps, this rough, cheap copy of the European argon lamps, fueled by whale oil. Now, these Winslow Lewis lamps, they are employed in what I always call or tell people, they're a giant chandelier of sorts, hanging atop Old Baldy Lighthouse, all right? There are, in 1838, in 1838, we know that there are 14 of these placed around Old Baldy. I'm getting a little lost here in my notes. You can tell that this is not anything to do with the Civil War because I need notes. Yes, so we know that there are, we're not quite sure how many lamps are up there, but we know that they're employing this second piece of technology that Winslow Lewis is using for these lamps. And they are what we call parabolic reflectors. So you can imagine this rough copy of an argon lamp that Winslow Lewis is using with the wick. The wick and the flame is emitting light 360 degrees around the flame. And that's a lot of wasted light. You think about it, the light that's going upwards and downwards and landwards and seawards, you know, it's a significant amount of wasted light. So Winslow Lewis needed a way to adapt or to cast or to reflect some of this light that's going landward and upwards and downwards out back onto the horizon where it would do some use for these mariners. So Winslow Lewis created what we call parabolic reflectors, all right? Parabolic reflectors. These are spherical shaped copper pieces of metal, is how I describe it. They're copper pieces of metal, spherical in shape, like half of an eyeball or half of a sphere. And they're placed directly behind that flame. This piece of copper is silver coated, and the reflection of that metal surface is going to bounce some of that light from the metal, from the parabolic reflector placed behind the flame, and cast it back out onto the horizon. Now, originally, Old Baldy has 14-inch reflectors. They're going to be replaced by 21-inch reflectors. And as I was struggling to say early, there are a total of 15 of these lamps placed atop Old Baldy in 1838. So 15 Lewis lamps, originally having 14-inch circumference parabolic reflectors, and then by the later on they're going to increase the size to increase the surface so more metal is placed behind those flames in order to cast out. They went from 14-inch to 21-inch, a total of 15 of these placed atop Old Baldy in what you would consider looking like a big old chandelier up there. All right. So that is where our oil transfer pan comes into play. So this is the can that the lighthouse keeper, be it Sedgwick Springs, the first lighthouse keeper at Old Baldy, or Thomas Mann Thompson, the lighthouse keeper before the American Civil War. He is going to the cistern. There were cisterns on lighthouse reservations. I think just like a cistern is used that you may be familiar with from the 20th century. It's these giant vats or giant barrels stuck into the ground, and it collects rainwater to be used for washing and for cooking. Well, these whale oil cisterns were very similar. They were giant vats or barrels that were placed somewhere around the lighthouse, and it stored gallons upon gallons of whale oil. And the lighthouse keeper would take some of that whale oil, place it in this transfer can, and then this is what the lighthouse keeper would carry to the top of the lighthouse night after night, and use this transfer can to pour the whale oil into each of these fountains placed behind the Winslow Lewis lamps, 15 of those atop Old Baldy Lighthouse. And when he filled up the lamps and their fountains, that would be enough fuel to have Old Baldy illuminated for the rest of the night. And then in the morning, when the lighthouse keeper would go up there and extinguish all the lamps, there would be a whole lot of polishing involved. You have to polish all those parabolic reflectors, all 15 of those placed behind the hollow wicks. So all that soot that is being collected on those overnight is going to be cleaned to make sure that that's nice and shiny to cast out on the horizon. All those chimneys, those glass chimneys, they're going to have to be cleaned to remove the soot. The wicks are going to have to be trimmed, these cotton woven wicks, to ensure that the next night they are efficient. And then as darkness set, after all that polishing and all that preparation, the lighthouse keeper, Sedgwick Springs or Thomas Mann Thompson, is going to once again fill his transfer pan, carry it all 108 stairs to the top of Old Baldy Lighthouse, and then fill all 15 of those fountains behind Winslow Lewis's lamps to begin the process all over again. Now this is made of brass, all right, And you can see in the bottom, might not pull out, but this is for the United States Lighthouse Service. You can see the marker right there. It says U.S. Lighthouse Establishment. And then there's another one that says Staten Island down below. Staten Island, New York. And all the phones going off this morning. And that was common with technology or equipment used for the lighthouse service. They would stamp these. It wasn't like the lighthouse service went out and just bought, all kinds of a hodgepodge of different resources and tools for these lighthouse keepers to use. No, they had kind of their own patent, their own model, so everybody got the same thing, regardless if you were a lighthouse in Florida or your lighthouse in Maine. So, what happened to Stephen Pleasanton and Winslow Lewis? Well, Congress and the Mariners, how old was Lewis during his invention? Mimi, I'm not quite sure I know the answer to that question. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question, Mimi. I can find an answer for you and post in the comments afterwards. But great question. I think he's middle-aged. So Winslow Lewis's copy of this European technology was not very efficient or effective, as we said. Many of these parabolic reflectors were not true. They were more spherical, which is inefficient. And eventually mariners complained enough that by 1852, there was a congressional investigation into the lighthouses of America. This investigation's report was submitted on February 6, 1852, and based on that report, and based on Stephen Pleasanton's, inability to be a true model of efficiency for the lighthouse service, more invested in saving some bucks and being an efficient auditor or bookkeeper, that is the year 1852 when the U.S. Lighthouse Board is established. It is a 9-member board of professionals who are now going to facilitate the activities of America's lighthouses. We're going to take it out of the hands of this accountant and put it into the hands of a 9-member board full of professionals who are more invested in finding efficient and effective technology rather than the cheapest technology. So fortunately for Stephen Pleasanton, he passes away around that same time, so he does not have to live with the disgrace of getting fired, if you will. And slowly but surely, after the establishment of the U.S. Lighthouse Board in 1852, Winslow Lewis's lamps are going to be replaced with this new technology called Fresnel lenses. And these Fresnel lenses use glass rather than copper, silver-plated pieces of metal to refract this wasted light back out onto the horizon. And we have discussed in previous episodes these Fresnel lenses, their technology, and our very, very famous Fresnel lens that was employed in Cape Fear Light Station here on Bald Head Island from 1903 to 1958. Kira, what made the light flash in sequence, or was it just a constant beam then? That's a great question, Kara. Old Baldy had a combination over time of fixed lights and a combination of flashing lights. Fixed means constant. It never flashed. It was just one light up there all the same time. Throughout Old Baldy's experience, her fixed lights sometimes were white and sometimes they were red. And of course, that was created by different colored glass that the light is casting through to create that color. But Old Baldy did flash at some points in her existence, and Cape Fear Light Station flashed as well, established in 1903 out towards the modern-day conservancy. And before they were automated, these flashes were created in an old clockwork system that would be wound up by the lighthouse keepers, and through gravity, at Cape Fear's light station, a weight being pulled down all 150 feet of that stairwell in the middle of the lighthouse. That weight being pulled down, the use of gravity, would turn this clockwork mechanism that would revolve that lens first on brass chariot wheels, and then later it was revolved, I think about 1920, it was revolved in a pool of mercury. And that would pull that lens the whole way around to create that flash. And once that weight went to the bottom of the lighthouse keeper would have to crank that weight all the way back up so it could repeat the cycle, pulling that weight down and revolving that lens. You go to many lighthouses like Currituck Lighthouse. This is a great example. Currituck Lighthouse up in Kerala. They have a sand pit at the base of their lighthouse. And that is where the weight would eventually reach the bottom or reach the ground. The sand there to kind of give it a soft landing, if you will. And then the lighthouse keeper would wound it up. So that's a very, very great question, Karen. So, after 1852, when the U.S. Lighthouse Board is established, these boards of professionals, that is when lighthouses across America get this new technology replacing Winslow Lewis's lamps, and that would arrive at Old Baldy in February of 1856. But we'll dive into that history a little bit later as we continue to explore this lighthouse technology. Michelle, Winslow Lewis was born in 1770, and the light was patiently, So the light, exactly. It was patented in 1810, and then it was in 1810 was the light was patented, and then in 1812 is when the government purchased his patent in order to employ it in lighthouses across America. Yep. So one more little thing here. I want to show you a picture of what this looked like, these Lewis lamps atop Old Baldy Lighthouse. So on one of our panels here, that is what the lamps look like atop Old Baldy Lighthouse. And you can see there is the lamp inside. You have the fountain behind. That is what's fueled with whale oil. It reaches the argon lamp inside. That is where the hollow wick is with this glass chimney. And then you have the parabolic reflectors, these copper parabolic reflectors that are coated in silver to cast that light out onto the horizon. And these are placed on, like I said, what looks like a giant chandelier atop Old Baldy Lighthouse. So if there is maybe a lesson to take away from this all, it's this fact that perhaps this theory or this kind of mystery that the lighthouse keeper, he was carrying all this weight atop the lighthouse day after day, night after night, this poor lighthouse keeper. Well, to debunk the myth, and there's a lot of different theories about this. You go to different lighthouses and they have different ideas. I feel pretty confident, based on conversations with lighthouse historians in the state, I feel very confident in interpreting here at Old Baldy that the lighthouse keeper would have been carrying no more than 5 gallons of fuel to the top of Old Baldy each evening. 5 gallons, folks. Certainly no small feat, night after night. Sedgwick Springs was an old man when he is lighting Old Baldy for the first time in 1817. He's not young, no young spry man. So no small feat, but to put it in perspective, it's about 5 gallons No more, no less, and it would be once a night. That would suffice to keep old Baldy lit all evening until the sun rose again. So thank you for joining us this morning for this edition of Quarantine Collections. Great questions, great dialogue. Thank you, Michelle, for your help in answering that one question before I could get to it. We are going to have some sort of program this afternoon. If it is raining like it is today, of course, we're not going to be able to get outside, but we will come up with something for you at 2 o'clock, all right? So we hope to join us this afternoon at 2 o'clock for some sort of adapted Touring with Travis. Again, as always, we thank our essential employees out there for keeping our society running during these distressing and crazy times. We thank our healthcare workers and our doctors, our truck drivers, our grocery store workers, everybody out there that is continuing to go to work while we all stay at home and socially distance to stem this curve. Seems like the news is getting somewhat positive. There's a lot of death and there's a lot of pain out there, and it's scary. But it seems like all our social distancing is working. It is working, folks. What we're doing is having a significant impact on the state of the nation. And that is surely something that we can all be proud about, that we're doing our parts and we're helping to relieve some of this pain in our nation. So I really hope that the good news continues, that this is all over very soon, and we can welcome you all back to Bald Head Island. So in the meantime, stay positive and stay healthy, and we'll see you at a future broadcast. Thanks, folks.